We can upgrade Stephen to a panelist.
Okay.
So, let's see, make sure it's recording.
I'm just gonna run and get some water. I'll be right back.
Absolutely, no problem. I'm looking for him. Where is he? Where are you, Stephen Schwartz? Man. See, some people are here, which I appreciate. We're just taking a small pause. We're having trouble getting one of our panelists onto the onto the screen here, so bear with us. All right. Good to see you, John. It's been a long time. All right, I see some familiar faces and some new faces here. So once again, we're having a few people emailing me in a panic saying that they can't get on. So we'll just have to wait a minute and see if we can work that out. But well, I'll go ahead and start kind of introducing what we'll be doing over the course of the hour, and hopefully our friends will join us soon enough. And if not, we'll get started on one reader before the other one joins us. So I just want to thank everybody for coming today and joining us for the Celebration of Literary Arts, sponsored by Des Moines Area Community College. This is our 19th year of doing the festival, and similar to last year, because of the ongoing pandemic, we are continuing to go online. We'll have a few face-to-face readings here on our campuses, but mostly we'll be doing it virtually. So I really appreciate everybody joining us. And of course, over the course of the semester, you should keep in touch with our schedule as it's slowly making its way. But I just wanted to mention some things about the webinar. If you've never been to one before, we won't be able to see your faces, but you will be able to interact with us. So we have a chat here that, in place of a face-to-face audience where the authors can kind of read the room or if there's applause, we have a chat. And so people can ask questions or reinforce certain lines or moments that they enjoyed or ask questions, and we try to get to them as best as possible. And then we also have a Q&A Dropbox, right? So this is a more formal way to ask a question. So anytime during the reading, if you want to enter a question into that Dropbox, nobody's going to see it except for me. And at the last 15-20 minutes, we'll try to devote all that time to your questions. So anytime you have a questions about the writing life, publishing process, anything that our writers are talking about, feel free to ask, and they'd be more than happy to talk to you about it. But right now, I'm going to be introducing at least one of our writers here. We have two. Oh, Stephen is here. Hold on just a second. I'll promote him to a panelist. He should be coming into the scene here in just a minute. All right, excellent. So we will, I'll be introducing both our writers here today, and then we'll start off with a little conversation, just kind of ask some questions about their newest projects. And then we will hear them read from their work for about 10, 15 minutes apiece. And then we'll once again spend the last part of the hour asking your questions for them to answer. Right? So today I'll begin with Alex Oline, who has written 6 books of fiction, most recently a story collection called We Want What We Want. Her work has appeared in The New Yorker, Best American Short Stories, and many other places. She lives in Vancouver, and she is the director of the UBC School of Creative Writing, and she teaches for the MFA program at Warren Wilson. We also have joining her, Stephen Schwartz, who is the author of 4 collections of stories, To Leningrad Winter, Lives of the Fathers, Little Raw Souls, and Madagascar, New and Selected Short Stories, and the novels Therapy and A Good Doctor's Son. His fiction has received the Nelson Elgren Award, the Sherwin Anderson Prize, and the Plowshares Cohen Award, a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, and the Colorado Book Award for the novel and literary fiction, and 2 O. Henry Prizes. He is a professor emeritus of English at Colorado State, where he has taught in the MFA program for over 30 years and now serves as fiction editor for Colorado Review. And his latest book is a novel entitled The Tenderest of Strings. And I'm just so glad that both of you are joining us for the kickoff of our series.
Thanks.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Absolutely. So I just wanted to maybe begin thinking about like a bigger question that, you know, it's kind of an age-old question about novels versus short stories. And I know that both of you guys are short story writers and you both have novels out in the world. So we were curious about maybe the difference about how you approach a novel versus a short story collection, or the pitfalls that you fall into with either genre, how they're alike or similar, and how they're obviously different as well. So Stephen, you have the latest novel out. Do you want to tell us about your approach for the latest novel, The Tenderest of Strings, which just came out a few weeks ago?
Yeah, I mean, this is a difficult question to answer because for me, you know, writing a novel brings into so many more considerations. You have to think about setting, for instance. A number of my short stories have a setting, but it's somewhat irrelevant. And, you know, in a novel, of course, you're going to go for pages and you're going to have some real intimacy with that setting. And it's going to figure into the story, you know, not just as a backdrop, but, you know, significantly with the characters or even as a character in the story. You have to know what your characters do, like what their work is. And in a short story, I can just say, oh, so-and-so, you know, was a professor, so-and-so was an accountant, and I can give a few details about it and get away with it. There's absolutely no way you can do that without putting more on the line. And then, you know, I mean, you have to decide on how many points of view you're going to have. For me, you know, it's been usually I have 1 or 2 points of view, but I was really impressed by your collection, Alex. You know, We Want What We Want. How many stories have like 4 points of view, and how dexterously you handle it. So I'm not saying that short stories are necessarily limited in terms of the point of view. We can get into that further, just like, what it means to develop, primary or secondary characters in a novel versus a short story. And then the final thing I'll say is that, in a novel, you have to know, you know, how many subplots, let me put it this way, how much layering you're going to have in that novel, and how many sort of narrative lines are going on, that, in a short story, you might just have one. So in, in The Tenderest of Strings, it wasn't until very late that I realized that I needed two more significant characters in there and a very important subplot going on. And, to make the novel work.
So when you had that subplot, how do you know how many you have before it becomes like burdensome? Or because you kind of beholden to all of them when you start creating these different characters, and how do you know if you have the right one? And can you just talk about like these subplots and how they inform the main storyline a little bit before we go to Alex?
Yeah, I can't really answer that question without talking about this nexus of character, voice, and let's call it momentum. You can call it plot or anything you want. But if you think of a novel, and here I'm going to qualify, novels have many different structures. They can be associative, they can, be circular. I'm not talking about just a linear novel, but they do need some kind of deep and forward momentum. And what I mean by that is that there's a vertical axis where meaning is occurring and purpose, and then there's a horizontal axis where the story is moving on in some way. So, those are the things to keep in mind to decide whether you have too much. It's like a truck with a maximum load. I'm more keeping that deep and forward motion in mind, and whether each of those things are working together, this deep and forward movement, this horizontal and vertical axis, or are they conflicting with one another? Is the action canceling out the character, or is the character, just overwhelming and not much is happening in the story? I'll just say one more thing. A very good short story writer, Charles M. D'Ambrosia, came to do a reading at our university, and I was very impressed by his story he read. And I said, there's such a nice combination of this nexus that I was just mentioning. And he said to me, at one time, that story was all voice, and I had to come up with some kind of action to undergird it in some way, to create that kind of movement. So those are the things you're always thinking about, and you're thinking about them par excellence with a novel more than a short story.
Yeah. Oh, that's great advice. Alex, do you want to add on to that? Like you writing in both genres and how they inform each other or difficulties that you run into?
Yeah, I found that incredibly instructive, Stephen. So thanks. I love that idea of the axis. For me, I think I'm a slightly different writer in each genre, and they each have different kind of difficulties, but also different pleasures. And for me, the short story it feels really elastic. It's a playground for experimentation and a place where I, as a writer, feel like I can take a lot of risks. I could maybe do something unusual with structure, or work with a character that I'm coming at from a strange angle. And I can ask the reader to sort of ride along with that for 20 pages, whereas sustaining it over the course of an entire novel would be kind of a bigger ask and would require more of those kind of deeper layers of scaffolding that I think Stephen was talking about. So when I go to the short story, I often think of it as like, what can I do that would bust this thing open? What risk can I take? What way can I sort of push against the boundaries of the form? For a novel, I think I do need to be more of a planner in the ways that Stephen is talking about. I used to have this very kind of folksy editor who would always be saying things to me like, "Well, Alex, that dog won't hunt," about a particular project, or in one case about a relationship, and he was usually right about both things. But what has happened to me with a novel is that I'm not generally a big planner. I'm pretty organic about it, but I go in and I start drafting, and then I get to around page 50. And that's the point where the dog won't hunt, where like things cannot be sustained if you don't have enough of that forward movement, that propulsion that Stephen was talking about, whether it's a narrative engine or the trajectory that the characters are on or the thematic idea. Hopefully all three things are happening and you can kind of visualize the journey that the book is taking. So if you can't make it past page 50, for me, usually I start over again and I start thinking about, okay, where can this story go that can sort of live in the large space that is a novel, and spend some time thinking about it and trying to figure out how to build that structure.
It's really interesting that you you see, like, often we assume the short story is going to be about compression, but you see it as like elastic and what, blowing it open. And I see that in your stories from your new collection as well, What We Want, and even the first story, Point of No Return, in which you jump time over a course of an entire life within a paragraph sometimes. And then the following story, Casino, will take place in a very small time frame and a little bit more compression. So I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about how you use time in short stories, and when is kind of like what we're talking about with Stephen, like when is it too much cargo or something for it to hold?
Right. Yeah. I love talking about time in fiction and thinking about it. And it's one of those sort of rules that you learn when you're starting out with writing, like, oh, confine a story or a poem to like one moment, or to make it more manageable for yourself. And it's not that that's bad advice, but I think there's always excitement to be found in breaking, some of these rules. And for me, like my big hero, muse, and mentor in short story writing is Alice Munro, the great Canadian story writer. And she just moves super fluidly around in time. And she'll often pick up from one moment in time, and then in the next paragraph, it's 50 years later. And for me as a reader, in reading that work, I always felt this like whoosh of energy that came into that, seeing the characters from a new angle. So I love the way that dramatic movements around in time can push against the reader's experience of a short story that you can read perhaps in one sitting. So you've traveled around widely across a whole life in the space of, let's say, half an hour or an hour. And to me, the experience of moving around in time is a part of human existence that fiction is particularly well situated to express, right? Because we have access to interior thoughts and memories and forecasting towards the future, all within our own minds. And we can write about that on the page in ways that perhaps other forms of media like film or TV, which are more about, the moment by moment, have a harder time doing. So I guess I think that we are all time travelers in the sense that we live in the past, present, and future inside our own heads. And I love the way that we can use fiction to talk about that and what it's like to be a human being in that way.
Awesome. Oh, go ahead, Stephen, please.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up on really good comments by Alex. I think of like the space break as God's little gift to the short story writer, if you want to move around in time. And it's very different than, of course, in a novel where you have chapter breaks, but so much depends on figuring out the character's arc for how much time is going to pass. Like, are we going to, have you set out in the beginning, or do you know that you're going to tell a long story here that involves an older character, and that you're going to watch that character move from being a youth to an older person? Or are you going to handle that in flashbacks only and keep the time more compressed? And, I know I had one story that covered 40 years, and it was told in present tense, and I wanted to have it capture the immediacy. So I started the character when he's young, but he ages about 30, 40 years during the course of the story. And it just seemed that time and movement of time was necessary towards, understanding the full life of this character. So, once again, I guess I would throw into that nexus I talked about, time itself in terms of voice, character, and action. And just again to follow up on something Alex said, this is the wonderful thing about the short story form is you can experiment with it. You can do so much in terms of different voices, different time sequences that we're talking about, and it's harder in a novel to do something so radical and keep it going for an extended period of time. But that's why you find a lot of short story collections, and I think the ones that work best are where the author, you can see the author experimenting. You can see them trying out new forms, trying out new voices, um, just using every single element of fiction that they can to do something original.
Do you think that's just because it's a smaller space and so therefore you get to have a little more focus? Whereas in a novel, if you try to be more experimental, it's just more difficult to sustain and it becomes gimmicky or burdensome, or when you try to do too much?
Well, they always say a novel is a work of compression. Well, that's true to some degree, but a short story is almost a miniature uh, work of compression. And um, you know, there is just uh, you know, you take that into consideration in terms of a short story. For me, it's something that's exclusive in the sense that it excludes a lot. If I'm working on a novel and I go to the grocery store and somebody next to me is having a discussion about cantaloupes, I'm thinking, I could put that in. That will fit. The novel is like a central vac system. It just wants to suck everything in, whereas the short story just excludes everything. So yes, that time and that compression actually help with that experimentation in a way that, the kind of expansiveness of a novel sort of keeps it at bay.
Gotcha. Well, I could talk about this all day long with both you guys, but we want to hear a little bit of your work before we move to the Q&A from the audience. So Alex, do you want to start us off maybe reading something from your newest work?
Sure, yeah, I'd love to. Thank you. So I'm going to read the first part of one of the stories from the book, We Want What We Want. And this story is called The Woman I Knew. I first read Mulvaney's book, The Woman I Knew, when I was 13 years old, an impressionable age. Although I should say I was impressionable at all ages, especially where books are concerned. I wanted books to press themselves upon my body and mind, to change me in every way a person could be changed. I don't know where I got this idea, as I came from a home almost devoid of books. My parents were from a small town in New Hampshire, neither of them with much money, and my mother worked as a waitress to support my father as he went through medical school. He became an ER doctor who tended with meticulous, coiled energy to people like those he'd grown up with, people in exigent circumstances with stark, immediate needs. Novels, if he'd thought about them at all, would have seemed frivolous to him, and to my mother too. Mulvaney's book was what my mother called smut, though it had won the National Book Award for fiction the year I was born. I found it in the 50-cent box at the local library sale. I was drawn first of all to its cover, which showed a black ink drawing of a woman's body, her naked back arched in a parabola. The thick black lines of her shape communicated confidence, as if the artist were someone who understood exactly what he saw. At this time in my life, early adolescence, I was obsessed with the idea of an invisible, unknown spectator, that there was a person watching me, a man, older, who saw something special in me, who was my particular and desired audience. In retrospect, I'm very lucky that this attitude didn't get me in more trouble than it did. I read Mulvaney's book over and over. It was how I learned about orgasms and blowjobs. It was also how I learned about language, because Mulvaney was an exuberant stylist whose long and rhythmic and vibrant sentences cataclysmed into paragraphs. And even now, years after the last time I read the book, there are passages I can recite from memory. My parents sent me off to state school in Vermont with the hope that my bookishness might transform into something vocational over the course of my degree. There was talk of my being a teacher or going into advertising. I didn't know what I wanted. To me, 4 years seemed so long that there was no point even visualizing what might happen at the end of it. I took my classes, worked at the campus dining hall, and forgot entirely that once I graduated, my student loans would come due and there would be a reckoning. My roommate was from Southern California, and once the spectacular Vermont fall gave way to winter, she hated the cold and dark and fell victim to seasonal affective disorder. She spent each day huddled under her duvet in our room, refusing to go to class, and then she went home in December, swearing never to return. I was thrilled by the idea of my own room. Even though I still went down to the hall to the bathroom and showers, this was more privacy than I'd had at home. So I was disappointed when I returned to campus in January to learn that I'd been assigned a new roommate, also from California, named Iris Dolores. The fact that she had two first names, two old lady first names, also seemed a bad sign. But Iris Dolores was not old ladyish. She was 21, having failed out of 2 previous colleges. She told me cheerfully, starting her freshman year for the 3rd time, and a drug addict. She'd brought almost no stuff, and her side of the room was decorated only with the thin institutional blanket and pillow provided by the school. She had long, dirty blonde hair, and she wore ripped jeans and a men's button-down shirt with a parka over it, even inside. "You don't mind if I fix, do you?" was the first thing she said to me. And she took out her kit and prepared a needle and shot heroin between the toes of her left foot. I'd been around drug users before. My town was full of them. My father's job was full of them, but I'd never lived with one before. When she was done, she laid back against the flat pillow and smiled at me dreamily. Iris and I lived together for the rest of college, first in the dorm and then in a drafty, noisy second-floor apartment above a pub on Main Street in town. I'd initially assumed that she'd failed out of her 2 previous schools because of her drug habit, but this turned out not to be the case. She was regimented about her using, compartmentalized, discreet. With academics, she was the opposite, spectacularly lazy and undisciplined. She went to class spottily, and even if she liked the subject, she rarely completed the work. She enrolled in a studio art class and spent hours painting, but didn't show the professor anything she'd done. "I'm not interested in his verdict," she said when I asked her why. I assumed that anyone who could afford to be so casual about school must be rich, but her financial aid package was similar to mine. We both had work-study jobs. Neither of us went home much. Iris's parents traveled often, and mine had already downsized with typical practicality to a 2-bedroom condo. When I went back, I slept in the spare room like any other visitor. We nestled in at school. We ate dinner in our apartment by candlelight, drinking Sangre de Toro wine and lining our windowsills with rows of the little plastic bowls that came with it. We read on the couch, our legs under a shared quilt. Sometimes she crawled into bed with me and we kissed and touched each other and fell asleep that way. And sometimes we slept separately, and that was fine also. Each of us had boyfriends who came and went, and we never had any discussion about our commitment to one another was or how far it should extend. It would have seemed beneath us somehow. At graduation, my parents presented me with a check for $5,000. It was my share, they said, of what they'd saved by selling the larger house I'd grown up in. They'd hoped I'd use it to get a foothold on my life after school, specific plans for which had yet to materialize. Iris was moving to New York, and I was going with her because I had no other ideas. The money from my parents was a generous gift, and it was also, I understood, their final one. After this, it would be on my own. Iris's parents came from San Francisco. Her mother, Tamsin, was tall and thin like her, with the same aura of hanging back in judgment, waiting to be impressed. And her father, Gregory, was curious and bossy, wandering around our little apartment, making wisecracks. He laughed out loud at our collection of Sangre de Toro bowls, picking them up and setting them down, and I wanted to shield them from him as if they might break. Then he browsed the bookcase for a while, saying, "I'm guessing these are all yours, right? Iris never read a book in her life." Iris ignored him. She had her dreamy armor on. She claimed her parents never noticed when she was high, and as far as I could tell, this was true. "So you're a fan of Iris's dad, are you?" Gregory said. I was confused. He'd pulled down Mulvaney's book with the woman drawn on the cover, one of 10 or so books I'd brought from home. "My bio dad," Iris corrected mechanically from the couch. When she saw me stare at her, she shrugged. "I hardly ever see him," she said. "John Mulvaney is your father?" Tamsin was sitting at our kitchen table, scene of all our candlelit dinners, smoking a filterless cigarette and picking the ash off her tongue with one long fingernail, which seemed both impossibly glamorous and completely affected. She'd been a model in her youth, and she still moved like someone who expected to be looked at. Of course, I'd told Iris how much the book had meant to me. In all our time together, there was nothing of myself, my earnestness, my confusion, my desire to have a different life than my parents without any idea of what that might look like or who I might have to be to inhabit it, that I had held back from her. I may even have talked about it while we were in bed together. It was impossible to me that she could have withheld this information. That night, after her parents were gone, we sat among the cardboard boxes we'd begun to pack and passed a bottle of Jägermeister back and forth. You talk about him like he's a legend, Iris said without preamble. To me, he's pathetic. He's a weird little wreck of a man. I haven't seen him in years. I didn't want to ruin your fantasy of him. I raised my eyebrows at her. I loved Iris, and she was many things, talented, affectionate, fun to be with, but she was rarely selfless. Like many addicts, she was a narcissist, and I'd never had any illusions that she placed other people's feelings before her own. What do you mean by wreck? I said. She pulled out her kit, and I shook at her, something I never did, and she set it aside. Sighing, she told me things. Tamsin and Mulvaney, she called him Mulvaney as I did, as if reading his name off a syllabus, had been together off and on through Iris's childhood. They couldn't agree whose last name Iris should have, so they left her with the two first names, Iris after Tamsin's mother and Dolores after Mulvaney's. They moved around, either for Tamsin's modeling jobs or Mulvaney's writing and research, fighting and breaking up and then reuniting in some new location they thought might fix the problems between them, whatever they were. When Iris turned 10, Tamsin declared she'd finally had enough. She moved to San Francisco with Gregory and quit modeling. What Iris remembered from this time was Mulvaney coming to the apartment in Pacific Heights, begging Tamsin to take him back. He was homeless, Iris said, and drinking heavily, and his beard was scraggly and he smelled rancid and unbathed. Tamsin, wearing a short purple dress, went down the steps to the sidewalk and told him to leave. He kneeled down on the pavement and took the hem of her dress between his fingers, rubbing it. Tamsin was unmoved. Iris watched him from the window, wanting only for him to disappear. Which he did. He went to Mexico to dry out and didn't come back for years. She'd seen him only occasionally since then, and they had little to say to each other. For a while, he wrote her letters, and she found them condescending and didn't answer. She considered her father nobody who should offer her advice. I think he means less to me, Iris said, than he does to you. I didn't know enough then to dispute this statement, or maybe I couldn't afford to. Iris was my path forward in life, and I took it. We moved to New York together, and Iris got a job at an art gallery, and I went into teaching as my parents had suggested. I taught at a high school in Brooklyn that was under-resourced and overcrowded. The students slept in class, they fought each other, they were angry and often hungry, and when they didn't see the point of being in school, I was hard-pressed to explain it to them. I came home at the end of each day more exhausted than I'd ever been in my life. Iris went to parties, and I did lesson planning. There were no more candlelight dinners. She stopped doing heroin and started taking Adderall, which helped her stay up late and charm buyers and artists. She was very good at it and soon got promoted. She had beautiful clothes. I wore chinos and cardigans from Old Navy, and every month I swore I wouldn't dip into the savings account I'd started with my parents' money, and every month I did. Some people swim in New York and others drown, and Iris and I no longer made sense together as we had in school. I made it in the city 18 months before I moved home, and we lost touch. And by the time I finally met her father, John Mulvaney, in person, I hadn't seen Iris in years. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Alex. I just have one quick follow-up before we move to Stephen. I'm so glad you read that story. I was curious about when you start the story, we kind of introduced to Mulvaney, and then we get introduced to Iris, and we kind of forget about the Mulvaney premise. And then, of course, he comes back in a very unexpected way, being the father of her roommate. That risks, I think, it risks being seen as maybe a little coincidental, but I feel like it totally works. And I'm just curious about how you kind of navigate the idea of like, that's, I don't want it to feel like too forced and packaged, but it feels like very unexpected still. I'm curious about how you thought about it as you drafted it.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it is a bit of a coincidence, but I also thought the other way to do it when writing a story would be to start with Iris and then have her pull out the book and then have the narrator say, oh, I read this book when I was young and it meant a lot to me. And that's more sequential, but it's much, much less impactful, I think, to the reader. And so what I tried to do when I started the story was to really anchor the book as specifically as I could in the reader's mind with that description of the cover and some like pretty concrete language around like the orgasms and the blowjobs. So there's something pretty memorable, right? So that when you do come back to it, then you're like, oh, I remember that moment. And for me, I hope that there's that kind of shock of the unexpected that brings with it a whole raft of association from the narrator's childhood and where she came from. And she's experiencing shock in the moment, and hopefully the reader is too.
Yes, I don't want to give it away because we want people to read it on their own, but she eventually does meet Mulvaney and kind of has an unexpected encounter with him that's not nearly as exciting as the cover was.
Yeah, right. To be clear.
I think you figured out, Mark, the story.
What's that?
I just want to follow up on something
Oh,
you
please,
said
yeah,
about
absolutely.
the story. Yeah, I read that story before hearing it here, and I noticed that coincidence. And you know, a while ago, I wrote an essay called "In Defense of Contrivance" and gave it as a talk also at Warren Wilson, where we both teach. And one of the things I discovered about coincidences, contrivances, is it's not so much what happens as what happens afterward to make it convincing. And what makes that convincing is when the roommate, who's the biological daughter, sort of shrugs it off and says, I just didn't want to, you were so high on the guy. I didn't want to disappoint you. And then we immediately abandon any thoughts of like, oh, this is just ridiculous. It couldn't happen. The roommate, the person, the book that's meant so much to this character and guided her life as whatever. So it's really afterwards how if you're going to have a contrivance, which I think you have to have a lot more of them in a novel, it's how do you make it, how do you get people to buy it? How do you get the reader to buy it? It comes in the aftermath of it.
Almost like downplaying it in the aftermath.
It's either downplaying it or some character explaining it or some kind of reaction that makes what was sort of implausible plausible by the context that follows it, as much as it's very key that the roommate reacts about that, and that that the speaker, the main point of view character, kind of just takes her explanation in stride too.
I love that. Thanks, Stephen. Yeah, there's a great episode of the podcast This American Life called No Coincidence, No Story, which is about, different anecdotes of coincidence. And kind of the overall point of it is that coincidence is inherent to our way of understanding the world because it has to do with patterns of meaning that we form. So you can talk about it as the contrivance, which it is, but it's also like fundamental to the way that we go through life, is to say, oh my God, isn't it amazing how this thing that I'm seeing right now overlaps from a previous thing? And that's part of our kind of basic human drive to find things meaningful.
Absolutely. And what goes on with coincidence is incongruency. And so much of what makes any writing original is some kind of incongruency. I mean, or a poem. It's like we're putting these two disparate things together that shouldn't really be together, but they're in a sense enlivening them and making them fresh in some way that we re-see them. So those coincidences or contrivances or whatever you want to say, actually illuminate, more than they kind of, what should I say, suppress some kind of reaction. One more thing I'll say about the story is, yes, at the end, the character does finally meet Mulvaney, and it's a great scene. And when you have something where you have a frame almost like that, the end of it has to be kind of carry so much weight. I think of Joyce's story, The Dead, where so much of it is about the party and the crispness, and you really don't know what's going on until the last 2 pages or 3 pages when you find out what the story is really about. But that's the emotional fulcrum of the story there, and that's what really carries it. And so whenever you're doing a frame like this, that final moment where you're going to remind the reader of how it started, you pull it off so well there, and really balance it out.
Absolutely. Stephen, would you like to read some of your work for about
Yeah.
20 minutes or so?
Okay. I'm just going to read the first few pages of the the new novel, The Tenderest of Strings. This only takes about 8 minutes. In the emergency room, Reuben's son Harry, 14 years old, sat on the end of the examining table. His new sneakers were caked with mud. He had his head down and a wad of gauze in his mouth where his tooth had just been knocked out. When Reuben walked in, Harry looked up. "You okay?" Reuben asked him. Harry took the gauze out of his mouth. "What?" "I said, are you okay?" His son's hair fell loosely over his forehead, his eyes hooded in fallen grace, the single left dimple of his infrequent smile nowhere to be found. He had a gorgeous olive skin, a white sculpted mouth like his mother's, and a strong angular nose of Semitic nobility, even if he'd been kicked out of Hebrew school in Chicago. "Which one is it?" Reuben asked. Harry pulled down his bottom lip, revealing a somber black gap. He was supposed to get braces soon. An orthodontist back in Chicago had advised them to wait until he was at least 13. That was more than a year ago, before they moved to Welton, Colorado, and now Harry had entered his teenage years with a windy hole in his mouth. Braces would have to be deferred until they fixed this breach. Wade Mitchell, Welton's police chief and Reuben's sometimes lunch companion, came in. He'd been in the waiting room, filling out paperwork at the reception desk. 20 minutes ago, he'd called Reuben from his squad car to say that he'd found Harry, who was supposed to be in school, walking along the old Welton highway and holding his hand to his mouth with blood gushing out between his fingers. That was all Reuben knew before he sped out to the Greeley emergency room after giving permission for Harry to be treated. The ER doc had stopped the bleeding, cleaned out the hole, given Harry a painkiller and a prescription for antibiotics. The next step was to see a dentist. With its dangling roots, the lost tooth floated in a preservative solution on the metal hospital cart. Fortunately, Harry had the presence of mind to pick it up and bring it with him. "Harry told me he tripped on a rock," Wade said. "Why weren't you in school?" Reuben asked. Harry avoided eye contact with either of them. "I was sick. Mom said I could stay home." "How come I don't know anything about this?" His son dabbed at the hole with the gauze, saw that the bleeding had stopped, and then wadded the cotton gauze up in his fist. "Are you in pain now?" asked Reuben. "I'm fine," said Harry, his bottom lip swollen and bruised the color of a plum. "If you were sick, why weren't you at home?" "I started to feel better, and I left the house for a walk." "A walk?" Reuben turned to Wade. "Where did you say you found him?" "Out on East County Road 30. "That's about 3 miles in the opposite direction. What were you doing there?" "Can I just go home, please? Doesn't it matter to you that I got hurt?" "Of course it matters, but you're lying to me. I know when you're lying." "It's not my fault, all right? Punish me or whatever you're going to do." Reuben looked at Wade, who had cleared his face of all partiality. Used to domestic abuse, robberies, and suicidal threats, he no doubt found this assignment an insignificant nuisance. It was a real kindness and favor, Reuben knew, for him to drive Harry to 25 minutes all the way out to the Greeley Hospital. "I'd rather know the truth," Reuben said, staring at Harry's sneakers. "Why are your sneakers so muddy?" "Just leave it, okay? Please don't ask me anything else. I feel really, really shitty." "This isn't going to get us very far," Reuben said, knowing he had locked on, as Ardith would say, and indeed in some acutely tender place, surrounded by his own calcified anger and frustration, He ached for his son and had no sternness left to berate him. Harry slid off the table. I'll walk home if I have to. What did you say you tripped over? A dead body. I don't find any of this funny. Ditto, said Harry. What's that supposed to mean? It means I just lost my fucking tooth. Gentlemen, please, said Wade. Perhaps you should work this out in private. I need to get back. Sorry, said Reuben. He felt miserable, weak with a brittle spite born of too many mishaps with his unhappy and difficult firstborn. And yet part of him wanted to gently remove the ball of bloody gauze that was wadded in Harry's hand and put something hopeful there in return, a smooth stone that would remind him, I'm your father and I love you. But the gesture seemed impossibly naive. Thanks, he said to Wade. I'll take it from here. Harry grunted at the idea. Ardith's reaction put Rubens to shame. As soon as they walked in the door, she swooped down on Harry with maternal wings. She chose not to cross-examine or confront him as Reuben had done. Instead, she sent Harry up to his room with an ice pack to lie down for the moment. She'd speak to him later. She exhibited a perfectly rational response to your child losing a permanent tooth, focused primarily on his welfare and not his behavior. And Reuben wished he'd shown the same grace. But his anger at Harry had been out of guilt. What had I done wrong? What had I missed that led to this and this and this before it? Meanwhile, Ardith had called the dentist. There were 2 of them in Welton, and made an emergency appointment to have Harry seen right away. The dentist told her to put the tooth in milk while conceding it might be too late to save the tooth. No one knew, and Harry wasn't saying, how long Harry had lost a tooth before Wade found him. Still, there was a small chance it could be replanted. I'll call you as soon as I know anything, Ardith said to Reuben. All business. She grabbed the car keys, her bag, the glass of milk with the tooth, somewhere at the bottom, like forsaken coral. She was still in her running clothes from this morning. Reuben said he would pick up their younger son, Jamie, from school if Ardith got held up at the dentist. At the foot of the stairs, she called Harry to come on. He did so, clomping down, still in his muddy sneakers. Ardith chose not to comment if she'd noticed at all. She was pulling him by the hand to hurry, the life of his tooth at stake. Sorry about that phone call.
That's all right. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Actually, this is a question that my students were asking me about, and I didn't have any answers either, but like, it's a messy question, so maybe do with it what you will. But you guys both read beginnings and we both talked about endings. And I'm curious about how those 2 literal bookends are like in relation to each other. And I guess the question is really about process, and it's thinking about like, how do you know you found your ending? How do you know if a story, a lot of my students are like, well, I can usually write the first 50 pages of a novel, 5 pages of a short story, and then it like stops, and they struggle, and it's probably something to do with something that's not working in the beginning, and how to find that ending. So I don't know, this is a broad question, but I was curious if you have any way to speak to that idea of process. Maybe Alex, do you want to like take a stab at it?
I want to hear what Stephen has to say, because that was such a beautiful opening, and so full of like mystery and intrigue, and so rooted to use a dental term in the kind of specific imagery, right, of real life, right? The image of the tooth and milk is so strong. So I mean, my sort of ideas around beginnings are that you're trying to bring the reader into the world of the story, right? And you're trying to give a sense of like, what are the terms? Like, what kind of world is this? What kind of people are these? What's the territory of the story? Generally, with an ending, you do want it to be somehow in conversation with the beginning in some way, and it's ideally it's taken you to some place that feels both unexpected and absolutely inevitable, right? That's the kind of idea that we often talk about. For me, every time I've written a novel, I wait until I know what the ending is, and then I go back and I write the beginning to make sure that it's actually setting the reader out on the appropriate course. But I'd be super curious to hear how you approach it, Stephen.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, two different ways. You know, with a short story, it's often that the beginning is the jetway and not the plane. And um, I don't know how many times, both when my own stories and reading student stories, I've gotten to page 5 and said, "This is where the story begins." And the 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 other part was necessary to write, but it was a wind up really to get there. In this particular novel, it started very differently in a previous draft. Um, Reuben, the father here, comes to the small town, Welton, Colorado, and he buys the small town newspaper. And it starts in the newspaper office and it sort of takes its time. Um, and Harry himself, uh, who becomes the main character, was not a point of view character. And at some point, I realized so much of the story had to do with his emotional vulnerability as a character. And so, I found a scene to put him up front that was more emblematic, I think, of what the themes were going to be. Although I don't think, of course, in terms of themes when I'm writing, but just in terms of the kind of uh, fire of the story. Um, and there's a writer, Steve Almond, who you might know. He has a great saying. He said, um, "Slow down where it hurts," and you can almost, really take that to heart in writing. If like find where the poignancy is, and uh, try and get to that in the beginning, and then when you get stuck in the middle, uh, what I would call the muddled middle, you often have to go back and look at where the antecedents are or where the roots are that need to be gotten in contact with again, that you've lost or you've taken a wrong turn. I certainly did in this novel, and tried to make things happen that really were all in terms of plot. And I wasn't back in touch with the emotional center of the characters. And so it sometimes helps to go back and just read those parts that have heat to them, emotional heat to them, to find out where your story is going or where it needs to go when you get stuck.
I think that's such good advice. And, one thing that I talk about sometimes with students is that our brains have all kinds of ways of tricking us. And one of them is with boredom. And if you are in that muddled middle that Stephen is talking about and you feel stuck and you don't like what you're working on or you feel bored, sometimes that's your brain's way of trying to protect you from the things that would be harder to write about or to write into. So thinking about, well, what am I avoiding, either in the lives of the characters or in terms of what I'm bringing to the work, that can be a way to sort of reanimate the middle. Like, write what you're afraid of, write what you're afraid might hurt. Go
Absolutely.
into it.
How many conferences over the years I've had with students where it's turned into a therapy session and said, what is it that you're not saying here? What is it you're afraid to say? What's that voice in your head from your mother or father is preventing you, from writing about, what you need to do in this scene? I sense something here, but I sense you're kind of writing around it in some way.
Absolutely. I love this idea that so you think like Alex, you're in a boring section or you're bored with your own writing, but that doesn't mean it's not working and you should remove it, but that actually is like an indicator that you should dive in deeper into that.
Yeah, sometimes. Yeah, absolutely. And like my new age friend always says, the only way out is through. And like sometimes you have to write through the hard parts, right, to get to. And maybe when you go back, eventually you'll compress that scene or you'll edit out, but you have to keep writing through it to get to the part of it that is actually real and authentic and the stuff that only you can write.
Yeah, I think people think of writers as being like a honky tonk piano and just kind of playing away on the keys and everything. Where more it's like, oh God, that's such a terrible sentence. It's so dull. You put your head down more. Um, you just kind of get used to it. You get used to writing badly, and you have to have some kind of faith in the process.
Speaking of process, you were mentioning wrong turns, and I was curious about how do you find your way out of a wrong turn, and how do you, I mean, I guess this is the age-old question about writer's block a little bit, just thinking about how do you write through. Do you guys have strategies or advice to young writers about how to find their way through a draft and in revision or even in first drafts?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think is I don't even really like the language of the wrong turn. I don't like the idea that we're revising towards one perfect version of the work, right? I think that there are only possibilities and different ways of thinking about the work. If I do this one thing, what's going to happen to my story? What kind of information is going to wind up being highlighted for the reader? If I add this plot thing, what are the consequences going to be? So I guess I just really advocate approaching the process of revision with as much openness as possible and like humility towards the work, and less putting pressure on yourself to think this has to be good or this has to be perfect or this has to get a good grade, and more on like exploring the possibilities of what happens when you make different choices. And then you can take that openness and then make decisions based on like what you're actually trying to achieve. What's most important to you about this work, and then how can you kind of write towards that?
Awesome.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I believe that when you're writing something, um, you can get too close to it, and you only have so many objective views before you have to ask for some editing. But at the same time, you don't want to show it to somebody before it's gestated on its own, because once you show it to somebody, you're in a kind of collaboration or collusion with them when their eyes are on it. Um, so, going back to what we said about time, I think time is really a help in short stories. I mean, I remember I had worked on a story for a long time. I kept showing to my wife, and at some point she said, "Do not show me this thing again until you make progress, significant progress on it. You're changing words, you're not moving on with it." So, I put it away, and I'm not kidding when I said 10 years went by. I went down to our mechanical room. I was looking through some old files which had student stories in there, and I came across this story, and I started reading the beginning. I thought, this is really good. Who wrote this? And I realized that I had written it, and that this is the story that I had, been forbidden to show my wife. But I immediately saw what was wrong with it. I had some, again, plot device where there was a fire, and I was trying to make something happen in terms of the plot when really I had to go back to again, to what I said before, the roots, and, just move on, but through the path of least resistance. And it was time. It was just setting something aside and knowing not everything is going to be written on the schedule that you think it is.
Yeah. We have a question in the Q&A, and this might be a good way to close out the hour. Um, he asks, what's the best way to give a character depth, but without going into a lot of lengthy exposition and summary? And I guess I would add on that, like, when is summary and exposition beneficial, and when does it work, and when doesn't it, I guess? Alex, do you want to like address that question about like
Sure.
exposition maybe?
Yeah, so I think it's true that what makes characters kind of come alive on the page isn't like more and more information. It's usually significant detail, right? So the image of the mother in her running clothes carrying the glass of milk with a tooth in it, that's so vivid in my mind. And it's a very minimal amount of information, but I can see it really clearly. So that's one thing, like a significant gesture or line of dialogue or image that really kind of roots the character in the reader's mind is one thing. And another thing is like characters can have some contradictions to them, some internal inconsistencies. So if you have a character who acts and speaks with a lot of bravado, but their interiority is full of self-doubt, that kind of layering helps to give a character a lot of complexity. People's attributes don't have to line up exactly in all the ways that they exist on the page, and that helps to kind of round them out as people.
Yeah, and that image that you're talking about, the image gives those layers of exposition, whereas exposition would just be like, she's a caring mom. Whereas like the image does like several things, opens up the character. I love that idea. Stephen, do you want to speak to this?
Yeah, I mean, a writer has at her disposal, description, narrative, exposition, dialogue, scene. Um, you can break up narration. You can write a quarter scene. You could write a half scene. You don't always have to write a full scene. You can incorporate indirect discourse. There's all sorts of ways you can play with the language to not make it a big block of dense prose that the reader feels obligated to get by to get onto the story. I'm always mixing up those modes, I guess, trying to look for which one is the best to employ.
I was kind of just a follow up to that. You were mentioning at the very beginning of the hour about this idea of nexus of like plot, voice, and character. And I think many people are like, okay, I get plot and I get character. This may be a big question that I try to end on, but like that mysterious idea of voice we were trying to talk about yesterday in my class about like how do you find voice or how do you work with voice? I was curious, maybe this is like the last question we could think about is like thinking about modes and how exposition can still be very voice driven. I was kind of curious if either of you could speak to this concept of voice and finding it. Stephen, do you want to start us off, and then Alex?
I'll just say that style is part of voice, but voice is larger than just style, and it brings in so many elements of the personality of the writing, but also like getting down to the essence of which character you're writing about. I mean, I have multiple points of view, and in this novel, and of course, any writer does in any work. And when I'm going into another point of view, I'm aware that I have to change the climate a little bit. I have to change that voice, and I have to figure out what is the expression of that character that's particular to that character that is melded with my own authorial voice. So, to me, again, you get to know it through who is this character? You just keep digging and digging and excavating it.
So, Alex, would you like to add your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, for me, all stories come through and from character. And so the voice and the style of the story emerge through the character as well. That's always been how I work and how I can see my way forward. But I think another thing I might just add is that sometimes I think students really worry a lot about originality, and they think that originality has to come from like the concept or the plot events of the story. And I actually think that it comes more from voice. Like the same stories are told over and over again, in culture, across generations, across, countries and languages, right? Stories of family, stories of falling in love, stories of adventure. What makes each one distinct is the point of view of the storyteller. And so leaning into that, into your own authority as the person telling the story is almost more important than anything else, and giving yourself permission to be the person who tells the story is a way to find the voice.
Yeah, I also add that voice is fluid. I mean, your voice in one story is going to be different from another, and is this a story that's going to be more comic, or is this a story that's going to be more serious? Does it allow for comedy? And if so, where does that comedy come from? Is it from the characters, or is it just a story that that would get in the way? So again, you look to the character, and you kind of look to the situation to figure out what particular voice applies here. But I guess I would recommend to students just keep experimenting. Don't feel like you have this little area that's just your little voice anywhere. Try out voices, imitate writers you like.
Yeah, give yourself permission to do that. I love that, Alex. thank you guys so much for spending the hour with us. It's been super enlightening. I'm hoping everybody in the audience is taking notes, and we're recording this to put it online. So hopefully we'll get several more views for people who couldn't make it during this hour. So thank you so much for coming, and I really appreciate your time.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
Mark.
All right, thank you so much. And for everybody else, keep an eye on the schedule. We'll have another reading coming up in a couple weeks with Matthew Olsman and Ruba Ahmed. And then we have on the tap Kevin Wilson and Jennifer Egan coming up pretty soon too. So stay tuned, and I appreciate you guys being here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.